Okay, great. Let me share my slides. We'll get started. Yeah, thank you also, Chloe, for making this awesome poster. Very happy to see that. Yeah, so I should just start by saying that this talk is representative of a work that is very much still a work in progress. So any questions, comments are extremely welcome. If I've missed out any key thinkers, I'd really appreciate if yeah, anyone has any suggestions. Okay, so with that in mind then, my key question here for today is, in what ways does the use of AI, image making technology, impact upon human creativity? Often when we're looking at questions of creativity and AI, the question is very much framed in terms of how is an AI creative? Less so focusing maybe on human creativity. So this is why I'm very much interested in this question today. Okay, so on the one hand, AI image making technology seems to have made a wider range of forms of aesthetic expression more accessible to a wider range of people. So if we just look to the realm of photography, for instance, there are a whole load of AI-driven image capture and editing features that anyone who has a smartphone is able to use, which again is great. It means that in theory, you know, everyone has a larger toolbox that they can draw upon to express themselves through aesthetic means. So there we go. Okay, so for instance, when we're looking at photo editing, in the past, you know, certainly digital editing software made it much easier to edit photographs than, say, you know, having to, as with analog photography, go to a darkroom and maybe cut negatives and paint over them to mask them and then rephotograph them essentially again and again. You know, this process is very much simplified and again made much more accessible with the use of software like Photoshop and Lightroom. But even this still required a fair bit of effort and some level of expertise in order to achieve the final photographic effect that was trying to be achieved. So yeah, just that little GIF there shows, you know, you would still have to, through the use of a stylus or a mouse, manually select what tool you wanted to use and still have to then actually kind of apply that tool for yourself. But with AI editing tools, this no longer requires a great deal of skill, effort, or resources. So smartphone cameras and apps can automatically apply certain settings and can prompt users even to make certain aesthetic choices, depending on what is automatically detected as being the scene. So if you look to the very far right hand side of the screen, this is just a representation of some of the things that the Adobe Photoshop camera app is enabling users to do. As you can see, if the app detects that you're taking a photo of food, then it will suggest some food lenses or kind of filters that will suggest the best effects so that you can get the best shots of your food. And as you can see, there are a whole host of other kind of exciting applications of editing tools that you can apply using this. You know, in the past, if you wanted to entirely change the sky, as you can see on the far left, you know, you would have to select that region for yourself, create layers, all sorts of things in Photoshop. Now with just the click of a button, it will automatically do that for you. Likewise, the use of filters on social media platforms and apps also provides the opportunity for just, you know, with a swipe or a click of a virtual button to entirely change what your image looks like. There are augmented reality effects. And yeah, as you can see just from the very narrow range here, you know, there are all sorts of different things that you can use these to achieve. It is also worth adding that there are, you know, that GIF that I showed earlier, you know, whilst like airbrushing would have been something that would have taken a little while to do, this is now something that can be done automatically as you can see here on the left-hand side, the Paris filter has been applied to this photograph. And again, just with the click of a button, this is all automatically done. Thanks to AI, it will just automatically detect what should be smoothed and changed in tone, for instance. That's something I'll come back to a little bit later, though. Okay, so also there's the advantage of image capture itself. So on the left-hand side, if you are aiming to achieve the so-called Bokeh effect, which I think is Japanese just for blurred, it just means that the main subject is the only thing in focus in the image, you would have to change the depth of field using your camera settings. Of course, DSLR cameras and the like did have certain settings, automatic settings that you could apply. But you would still need to know, for example, what kind of mode to put the camera in. And there were kind of limitations to this. It wouldn't be able to do everything for you. On the right-hand side, though, as you can see, is just a little advert for a smartphone where you can just choose immediately what level you want this kind of effect to be at. And it can happen even before you capture the image. So in the past, achieving these kinds of effects required a fair bit of input then from an agent, but thanks to recent advances in areas like machine learning and computer vision, AI algorithms, as I've just outlined, are able to detect what's in a scene and to make adjustments automatically to the features of the image without any really further input. Just to make sure that we're all clear on what exactly those things are, computer vision is basically just, again, trying to automate what we do when we see the world, or at least some aspects of it, which is categorizing things. So in this case, it's where a computer is able to process, analyze, and make sense of visual data. And as Marcus de Soto outlines, this was one of the most challenging aspects of the development of AI, hence why in recent years, we've maybe seen a little kind of mini explosion of all sorts of exciting applications of this in image making and visual art practices. Machine learning then is where the system can kind of learn. It's important to know that's in inverted commas, and modify its approach without direct human intervention. Yeah, it's important to note this isn't like human learning. This term refers to the automatic adjustment of parameters so as to produce the correct output for a given input. Steinhart's put it really nicely, I think, that instead of forming knowledge themselves, such machines can embody knowledge about the areas that they are trained in. So, as I say, with all of this kind of automaticity, this is all kind of increasing and growing, and machines are able to do more and more for us. In fact, sometimes we don't really even need to do anything at all. If you have a smartphone, your camera on that is probably doing a lot more than you might think. A lot of smartphone cameras will auto-enhance images. So this could be when you go back and you look through them and you kind of go to the edit mode, you might realize like, oh, the auto-enhance setting was already on. So maybe like the tones have been kind of zapped up, the colors look better. But it might also mean that, for instance, if you're taking a selfie, then the camera might automatically detect this and apply a portrait mode, for instance. So there's been a little bit of controversy about this in some cases. People have sometimes noticed in certain phones that it will apply things like a beauty face mode, which as this user found, there was someone who had freckles and were happy with that. When they took a selfie, that was those features of their face were entirely removed. As they then later found out, this mode had been applied at a very high level. The person who wrote this article got the same phone and noticed that it was applied at a slightly lower level. So they kind of knew that something was a little bit off when they were taking a picture of themselves. But yeah, they had to kind of properly investigate to go and find out. And yeah, it turned out this beauty mode, which is on. As they point out, it is activated by default. It is possible to turn it off, but you have to know it's been activated. And as they point out, it does take a little bit of fiddling. So it can be a little bit tricky to figure out how to do that. Okay, there's even more automation. So when Google develops what is already now being discontinued. Wearable camera, so they developed this in 2000, or released it in 2018. Google Clips, it used an algorithm that automatically deleted those images that wouldn't be considered memorable moments. So you can probably just see in the little picture up there, yeah, that those kind of memorable moments would just kind of pop up on the corresponding app. So yeah, so any pictures that the camera took that were, you know, maybe had kind of like a finger just in the shot or were a little bit out of focus, they were just automatically deleted. Instead, the camera would favor those images that comply with a pretty well-known kind of rule in photography, the rule of thirds concept of how to frame a photo. So the development of computational photography, this is just the term that's generally used. I'm not sure it's tremendously helpful, but it now just helps us to bracket off what kind of photography we're talking about. Has meant that even those with pretty limited photographic skills can, thanks to these intelligent automated processes, produce images that appear as though they have been made by someone who might be a professional photographer and editor. So that's just one area where AI has, yeah, kind of made available a wide range of means. There are also accessible AI platforms. There are many developers who are interested in visual artists becoming more involved in the world of AI. As I note here, it's becoming increasingly complex. There are algorithms and programming that without training in computer science, it's incredibly difficult to be able to even begin to tap into. So there are a number of different platforms. Artbreeder, for instance, I talk about Playform just because it's one that I've used, is an accessible platform that's been developed as an AI art studio for artists to use generative AI systems in their creative process without worrying about AI terminology and without the need to code or run open source code that is meant for experts. So essentially it was designed to also reduce the number of images and training that is typically required for what are called generative adversarial networks, which have been a particularly popular form of machine learning tool that has been used in AI image making practice. Just very quickly, these work as this diagram shows. So essentially, we have a discriminator that's trained on these kind of real sample images, the training sets. The generator then tries to generate images that will fool the discriminator into thinking that they've come from the real sample set. So we then get a nice little feedback loop so that if the generator succeeds and it fools the discriminator and it thinks that it fools the image that it's generated falls within the distribution of the training sets, then the generator gets a big thumbs up and will continue to kind of progress in that direction. So yeah, that's just a very, very quick explanation. If anyone needs more, please let me know. So yeah, so back to Playform. So these are some of the options that you have when you log in of what you can choose to do. The trainer model is perhaps the most kind of exciting. This is what happens when you start. So as I mentioned, I myself have used this. I've also mentioned a very interesting beauty filters. So for this particular set, I think I had about 35 images from Instagram of selfies that had been filtered using the Paris filter. Not my selfies, I might add. And yeah, I just wanted to see what will come out. So this is kind of the first snapshot when the model is at the very beginning of its training. A little bit later on, so it's probably maybe like a couple of minutes, maybe 15 minutes in or something. And as you can see, it gradually starts to kind of become better at producing something that, you know, definitely not quite as finished or as well kind of developed as I would want it. That's, you know, as I would want it to be in the end. But yeah, you can see how it kind of gradually becomes better as it goes on. Okay, so I should also mention that that was only a couple of hours of training. Thanks to the design of things like Playform, rather than tens of thousands of images and many hours of training, as the designers note, the AI model could be trained with tens of images and could produce reasonable results in just a couple of hours. And as the developers explain, all of the AI is hidden under the hood. Users choose a creative process, upload their own images, and press a button to start training. Within minutes, results will start to pop up and evolve as the training continues. So yeah, what's great about these systems is that they very efficiently, as you could see, generate a vast array of outputs. And that didn't even represent, I could have scrolled down and showed you even more outputs that it generated. And unexpected results are very common. So as with the computational forms of photography, platforms like Playform offer novices and those who are generally just inexperienced in computer programming the opportunity to automate choices and processes involved in creating images and to express themselves through a greater range of aesthetic means than may otherwise have been available to them. Now, some of you may have seen this over the last week. There are other accessible AI platforms. The latest one of interest is something called Wombo.art. So this is a text to image model. Yeah, philosophers jumped on this and were entering the names of their thesis titles into this, and this is the kind of output that it would generate. Very quickly, it turned very interesting. Someone entered Professor of Philosophy and noticed that, strangely enough, it yielded lots of images of seemingly old white men with white beards. Someone asked everyone to stop posting the weird AI art. In response, they got no fungi, text prompt generated image back, very good. And then finally, perhaps one of the most interesting comments I saw, all of the art from the AI generator people are posting is hideous and uncanny and shows that art is distinctly human and also a success term. But they did like reading those dissertation titles. So not everyone is super on board with the idea of AI in image making practice. Yeah, despite some of the benefits that I've noted, a lot of theorists have also highlighted that there is just the risk that with increased automation, the processes of aesthetic creation and aesthetic choices, values become increasingly homogenized and accordingly aesthetic diversity decreases. So Lev Manovic, for instance, has gone on to question, does such automation lead to a decrease in aesthetic diversity over time? A particularly pressing question, given that he notes that, we're only going to face more automation and more widespread across the globe as well as time progresses. There's also the issue of so-called filter bubbles. So this one is particular to social media platforms like Instagram. So Stephen Werning has asked, has stated, due to the limited range of available filters, de facto standards quickly established themselves for which kind of filter is right for which type of image. And accordingly, he suggested that the Instagram image filters constrain the user's range of conceivable visualizations of food, foreign countries, and otherwise overlooked places that only become part of the user's visual imaginary in conjunction with specific filters. And as he goes on to add, and I do think it was worth quoting these kind of in full, the introduction use of face filters feeds into the constraining of self-expression because the filters frame the unreflecting performance of established character archetypes from popular media culture as idiosyncrasy. Similarly, Emanuele Ariely has highlighted how the development of algorithms influences the perceptual sensibility and expectations we have towards images, the images to which we're exposed. And as he goes on to explain, a relevant consequence of the algorithmic analysis of photographic quality is the occurrence of a feedback loop between expressive preferences and expressed preferences and suggested images. Again, he talks about the visual filter bubble and the consequent convergence of photographic styles that contain features that are considered aesthetically more pleasing by the majority of users. And so, yeah, he talks about how for those uploading images with the goal of maximizing interest and appreciation by others, there'll be this incentive to follow the formal styles and cues that are most likely to be selected and suggested by the system. So he talks about this circular feedback process of learning and suggesting. Yeah, so it not only identifies, the algorithm not only identifies what is aesthetically optimal, as he says, but it directs those who produce images to actually follow that criteria as well then. There's also worries about creative lethargy and value homogenization. So Mark D'Inverno and John McCormack have suggested that deferring creativity to a machine encourages a creative lethargy on behalf of human users. In current incarnations, automating creativity homogenizes the creative artifact to a singular concept of value. And likewise, Ruth West and Andreas Barberno, in the introduction to a special issue of Art Nodes on the subject of AI and art, question, will use of machine learning as easily as a Photoshop filter lead to increased awareness or lack of awareness of potentially encoded bias or decreased artistic agency, and accepting whatever aesthetics are baked into the machine learning algorithm by its designers? Will this lead to unconscious application of a homogenized machine learning aesthetic as it is sublimated into digital content creation tools? So yeah, why does any of this matter? Well, if we follow the kind of thinking that Kevin Melchoni has made very explicit, the idea is that choice is really crucial to having a fulfilling aesthetic life, and potentially even to long-term flourishing. As he says, it supports personal autonomy, and on certain views might even be necessary for well-being. It's worth noting that he uses the term aesthetic choice specifically to denote choices for aesthetic experience, but this does still have relevance to the kind of more practical and production-based issues that I'm talking about here, as he proposes that an artistic practice implies a comprehensive aesthetic plan that over the years will transform the artist as an aesthetic person. So, in response to these concerns about outsourcing aesthetic choices and aesthetic creation, and what follows, I'm going to examine the role of constraints in image-making practice to assess how increases in automation and rule-based production processes impact upon those worries that are expressed about human creativity and aesthetic diversity. So we'll kick off by looking at how theorists have conceived of the role of constraints in artistic practice. So initially not very well. Traditional accounts of creativity tended to frame constraints as negatively affecting the creative process. So if we look at the Romantic tradition, which as Kieran kind of outlines, emphasized the creative role of the artist and demanded that art be the finest imaginative expression of the human mind. On this understanding, artists not only produce something different to what has previously been created, but do so as an expression of their own individual sensibility. And so, yeah, a really paradigmatic expression of this view, as Hilsenberg points out, comes from Kant, for whom creative genius cannot be taught, does not use rules, and cannot succeed through mere imitation. Bird and Hilser followed the development of this view all the way through to the mid-20th century, when other theorists, for instance, said the creative process can be defined as the ability to think in uncharted waters without influence from conventions set up by past practices. And certainly the Romantic tradition does, in some respects, continue to colour our understanding and appreciation of art making to this day. Just take the paradigm of kind of the lone worker, still very much with us. It is now widely thought that conventions and rules play a really vital role in the creative process. So if we look at someone like Margaret Bowden, writing quite a bit later on, of what she describes as the three main ways that creativity can happen, through combination, exploration, and transformation of different fields. Each of these exploit, as she says, stylistic and or conceptual constraints imposed by different artistic disciplines. So far from inhibiting creativity, it can even turn out maybe to be the case that certain kinds of constraints might actually enhance it. And in particular, it's been proposed by some theorists and artists that it's self-imposed constraints pertaining to the decision to work within or around the conventions that are particular to an artistic discipline that can help to structure the creative enterprise by helping agents to judge the results of their undertakings, but also by stimulating the search for new paths and solutions to take. So I'll start then with that first one, the kind of evaluation role. So for this, I'll turn to Paisley Livingston, who in his work has tried to better understand the relations between those moments of inspiration and an artist's plans and choices. So he's proposed that the at least provisional choice of and engagement with a given medium, art form, genre, and some more particular project can help agents to perform the evaluative function that is crucial to creativity. As he goes on to explain, commitment to artistic constraints crucially orients the creative process by establishing formal as well as substantive or content-related parameters and corresponding normative expectations and dispositions. So importantly, this doesn't mean that an artist knows exactly what they're going to do before they do it. That would be very uncreative. Rather, Livingston is really specifying this idea of artistic pre-commitments, which, as he says, can be formed through a deliberate choice or a more or less spontaneous engagement with an artistic scheme, project, or aesthetic. So essentially, this sees agents working with what might be highly schematic notions about the kind of work that they want to create, but crucially, this can help them to prevent the inability to experience that kind of aha moment when you realize that something has come together in the way that you were kind of, that fits in with your kind of overall goals. Yeah, and he says this is partly because the artist's response to options that emerge through hard work and inspiration involves the application not only of conscious criteria or principles, but also of a sensibility attuned to the orientations and purposes of a given project. So importantly then, artistic pre-commitments essentially attune and enhance activation of that capacity for response that isn't necessarily directly under one's conscious control. So in addition then to helping agents to kind of judge the outputs or the outcomes of their experiments, the self-imposition of constraints, Livingston suggests, could also be an effective way of enhancing inspiration. If I say to you, go and make something, that can actually almost be a bit scary. It can be actually too much. The choice to do anything, as I note here, can be really quite stultifying. You can essentially end up relying on things that have gone well for you in the past. So as Patricia Stokes says, responses rewarded in the past are repeated. And yeah, there are loads of cases from art history where artists from Da Vinci to Bacon have tried to break that cycle. They've tried to break their usual habits and proclivities towards certain kinds of approaches by deliberately choosing parameters within which to just allow events to take place, or in this really wonderful article that Turner's written, to cultivate chance. So for instance, Francis Bacon would sometimes just throw paint at the surface with the hope that he would then kind of find the portrait from the kind of, the random marks that were left there. Okay. Now, according to psychologist Patricia Stokes, it's actually the strategy of paired constraints that can generate novelty by directing and limiting the search for solutions in a problem space. So what this essentially means is that certain paths are precluded and others are promoted. And Stokes says that this is to structure the problem space so that you're not just going back on your kind of reliable techniques, those expected responses. Instead, this is promoting the search among risky, surprising paths to take. So she uses the example of the pop artists who, kind of fighting against the tide of abstract expressionism, decided not to explore emotional impact in their work. They instead would promote things like irony rather than improvisation, like a Jackson Pollock going into the studio and kind of just letting his unconscious, see what happens. They would promote pre-planning. So like Warhol's Factory is probably the best example of this. He barely printed any of his own screen prints. Instead, he devised what he wanted done and then left it for others to do. So there's a high degree of pre-planning there. and so on. So these are the kind of paired constraints that Stokes discusses. Obviously, these aren't necessarily like, written down by artists, but these are roughly the kinds of things that they, the parameters that they might set for themselves. Okay, so the idea then is that self-imposed constraints can help to generate and sustain novelty. But to self-select and self-impose these requires skill and knowledge. Indeed, as Stokes talks about kind of artistic training, at that point, you're really relying on someone to kind of set the parameters for you. So she's argued then that creativity of the generative influential kind does in fact depend on an expert selecting paired subject and task constraints to restructure an existing problem space and realize a novel goal. Now, this raises, I think, an interesting question. Should these constraints be arrived at by deliberation? If we go back to Livingston, for instance, he isn't quite as strict about Stokes as this. He suggests that pre-commitment is often, but not always, the product of the artist's deliberation and choice. He doesn't say too much more about this. I'm hoping to instead. He does, however, say that some such constraints are inherent in a specific technology or craft. Others may be proposed or imposed by a patron or producer, while others are more independently arrived at by the individual artist or group of collaborating artists. He also points out that, artists might become committed to an aesthetic, not the kind of theory thing that we're doing, but a cluster of norms, expectations, and discriminations pertaining to artistic projects. So my question then is it only self-selected constraints? And if Stokes is correct, these particular kinds of paired constraints that can enhance creativity? Or could it be the case, as maybe Livingston indicates, that creativity enhancing constraints need not necessarily be subject to deliberation or a matter of choice? Before I get to this question, I just want to delve a little bit deeper into those kinds of constraints that might not be a matter of choice. So Livingston lists constraints like the demands of patrons, these imposed constraints. These are imposed from the outside. But we might also add to those kinds of constraints others that are also not self-imposed. These might even include things like class, racial, gender, and other inequalities in society, or maybe conditions like physical impairments. So these are what I'm going to refer to as externally imposed constraints, where factors beyond the agent's control limit the choices that they are able to make pertaining to the formulation and realization of the features of their works. As Peg Brand has pointed out, surprisingly little has been made of such constraints in the philosophical literature. As she says in a really fantastic article on the subject, generally philosophers do not delve below the surface of their models of human creativity to notice the relevant underlying economic or social conditions, or to analyze the institutional structures that serve as preconditions for it. And she says, in other words, they do not recognize any role for factors such as gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, or global location. So we might wonder, well, what does this actually have to do with art though? Like, Livingston's talking about like medium and things that seem really, very directly related to the production of art. But as Peg details, mental states and lived experiences feed into creativity. And if creativity within specific domains, in her case, she's talking about printmaking, require access to training, education, and resources, as well as connections, depends on such specialized lived experiences that may not be open to all artists, then it might be appropriate to say that the disenfranchisement of certain artists, like women and other marginalized groups, is actually the marginalization of certain kinds of domains in which creativity may flourish, but not necessarily for all artists. So these kinds of disadvantages then, as Brand highlights, could really have a negative impact on creativity. So those are some candidates for what I call these externally imposed constraints. So returning to our we're going to park that there just for a second and we'll come back to it. Returning to technology, we might wonder kind of where we place this on this kind of scale of self-imposed to externally imposed constraints. So Livingston did mention that constraints are inherent in specific technologies and crafts. I think, and this is maybe where people might start to really disagree, perhaps, I think these would usually count as self-imposed constraints, in the sense that although certain ends might not be possible to achieve using certain media, agents can decide whether or not to engage with these, or they can at least kind of in principle learn about what possibilities these may offer. So for example, if I decide to make an etching, well, I know that I'm going to be using a needle to scratch into a plate. So that means that I'm not going to be able to create like a lovely kind of smudgy kind of effect. It's going to be, you know, lines. Likewise, you know, given that most printing presses are only a certain size, I know that I'm not going to be able to produce something that's enormous, probably. So yeah, it's very much, this information is readily available, what kind of constraints that kind of medium may provide me with. But in the AI cases, as I've mentioned, it's not always the case that we're aware of what we're entering into. If we consider some of those automatic applications, default settings, some of these might just go undetected by the user. Can you really be said to self-impose something you're not even aware of? Another really serious issue is that, well, even those who develop machine learning algorithms don't really know how, from the input, the algorithm ends up where it does. It's not clear how the machine is actually learning what it is. So if even the developers don't understand, you know, what hope do you or I have? Assuming we're not a computer scientist. So as these, as the theorists who I discussed earlier have, you know, suggested, the use of AI algorithms arguably also might de-skill users who might otherwise learn, for instance, you know, maybe how to produce particular photographic effects by manipulating camera settings or using tools to edit photos for themselves. And so it might be the case, you know, with this kind of creative lethargy idea, that this reduces the knowledge that agents may form of their image making practice. It might also be the case that, you know, if you're using those kinds of applications that automate pretty much the entire flow of, you know, capturing and editing an image, maybe this also might negate or even reduce your evaluative capacity, given that you haven't really started out with a clear, or not necessarily with a clear, but, you know, with a kind of schematic notion of what you're kind of aiming roughly to achieve, given that, you know, the algorithm will just do all of this for you. So yeah, so you don't necessarily maybe have the chance to develop those evaluative capacities that are vital, as Livingston says, for recognizing and working with some of those novel and potentially valuable paths and outcomes. As Livingston actually does go on to say, a key refrain in criticism of algorithmic, I don't think he's talking about AI ones here though, modeling of creative practices is that such models cannot perform the evaluative function that is essential to genuine creativity. So this is arguably less of a problem, or seemingly less of a problem, for those working on those kind of accessible AI platforms where users can meet the algorithm training sets. You know, given how much they spew out, even, you know, if you want to present this, you need to make some kind of selection. But again, it's still difficult to really understand what's going on, and so, you know, what kind of constraints the technology is actually presenting. So in certain circumstances, then, I'm going to suggest that AI algorithms may indeed externally impose constraints on users thanks to the selections that they make during the image making process. This can in turn potentially limit an agent's control over the kinds of choices that they're able to make relating to the formulation and realization of the features of their images, and also by extension, their ability to decide on their own constraints. If Stokes's approach is correct, then yeah, as those theorists worried about, this would indeed suggest that the use of apps and platforms that incorporate AI to automate certain decisions, like whether to preclude a certain kind of image composition, wouldn't enhance, and yeah, might even have that detrimental impact on human creativity and by extension aesthetic diversity. So to put this idea to the test, whether it really is only those self-imposed, self-selected constraints that can enhance creativity, I'm just going to look at a quick case study where an artist has been impacted by externally imposed constraints in order to try and establish the potential effects of this and to try and bring in some contingencies from kind of art history so that we can see whether it really is all doom and gloom for us going forwards. Okay, so this is where we come back to some of those other kinds of externally imposed constraints that I discussed. So in particular, I'd like us to look at an artist called Rodney, who, as Phillips and Cox have written about, had his creative processes constrained by his physical condition. Unfortunately, he spent his life grappling with the effects of sickle cell anemia, which causes a long, slow decline, which saw the artist regularly confined to hospital and reliant on all kinds of technological apparatus. But he would draw upon this experience and use it as a metaphor for wider social and political ills in contemporary society. In 1987, after an extended stay in hospital, he actually developed the idea to use X-rays as a medium for his art, and these hospital stays continued to inspire his output. Over the following years, he produced, as you can see here, images of scars and sculptures from his own skin and utilized advancing technology in order to produce his socio-political work. So for instance, unfortunately by 1997, he wasn't well enough to attend the opening night of his solo exhibition. And so instead, an autonomous wheelchair took his place. So this was a work called Psalms, and it made its way around the gallery in place of Rodney. So in addition to functioning as a representation of the artist in absentia, it also worked to demonstrate how moving in a wheelchair transforms the simple act of navigating through the world into really quite a complex series of problems to solve. So Rodney has been recognized in the art world for having produced really some of the most innovative and challenging work the last century. I think it's very clear that he was able to choose to promote certain paths in his working, but due to constraints imposed on him by his physical impairments, you know, he used, before he got seriously ill, he would paint, he would sculpt himself. Following, you know, the decline of his health, he really didn't have much room to structure his problem spaces and choose what paths to preclude, despite his expertise in these areas. So this I want to take to suggest that creativity of the generative influential kind doesn't necessarily depend on the expert self-selection of paired constraints. In order to account for how Rodney was able to produce such extraordinarily novel work, I'm going to take another little kind of look at creativity, and in particular, and sorry to anyone who's heard me talking about this at length before, creative agency. This is something that aligns more closely, I think, with Livingston's ideas about creativity. It's one as a form of agency that reconciles the Romantic tradition's emphasis on the artist as this kind of explorer of uncharted waters with those approaches that do also place an emphasis on artistic skills and knowledge. So usually when we think about kind of creativity as a certain kind of agency, you know, as Livingston has highlighted, we think about this as being quite goal-oriented. I argue elsewhere that we can think of this as a species of executive agency, in which an agent formulates and executes broad intentional goals, and these concern the nature of the features of the work, what kind of processes will be most appropriate to realize these, and also by extension the values of the work, which in these cases we're concerned with artistic and aesthetic values. So towards these goals, these agents take an executive attitude. So importantly, in common to these kinds of accounts of agent-centered creativity is the need for spontaneity. As I've mentioned earlier, you can't know exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it in advance. It's pretty difficult to do something new when you already know about it. So to be creative then, agents need to strike a balance between directed control. So this is, as Gort puts it, exercising knowledge of how to produce the work with the relevant values, and also spontaneity. So Rodney clearly developed and possessed an understanding of how to produce certain artistic values and aesthetic values while he was working in a highly spontaneous manner. And it's really this aspect of spontaneity that I think at least partly explains why he was able to quite so successfully negotiate the constraining effects of his physical impairments and produce such innovative works. And this is because of the often very fast changing constraints of his physical impairment. He frequently faced just no choice but to innovate new ways with which to achieve his aesthetic goals. You know, if he didn't innovate, then he wouldn't be able to formulate and try and achieve these goals. So, for instance, as he became sicker and sicker, he found new ways of realizing his ideas by directing a group of artists who were affectionately known as Donald Rodney PLC from his hospital bed, and would do this in order to produce works which would like mediate on the presence or lack of presence in the body by utilizing that neural network, for instance, for the Psalms work. So Gore has proposed that when creativity is an agential disposition has final value, as he says, when the conditions of its being valuable obtain, which partly depends on this spontaneous dimension of creativity. And I think that it's, in this respect that Rodney's accomplishments are also of significant value. He navigated problem spaces which he himself had very limited control in determining the nature of, and found novel solutions to pursue his practice in the face of externally imposed constraints. And yes, his artistic freedom seemingly was curtailed due to his physical constraints. But despite this, he was responsive and adaptive to those constraints, and in doing so was able to forge innovative new paths with which to achieve his aims. Another important point to add here is that, I'm not saying like, yay, external constraints, great, they'll really enhance creativity. These can have devastating effects on other aspects of one's life. But this example demonstrates that, like artistic creativity can offer an empowering way to exercise autonomy when circumstances might not otherwise, permit this. So yeah, as a highlighted, Rodney couldn't physically make every aspect of the later works himself, but he was able to exercise a high degree of agency by directing others to act on his behalf in a way that would successfully realize his goals. And yeah, such an accomplishment can have, I think, an important instrumental value. And this maybe brings us back to Melitoni's point in relation to aesthetic choices. It can enhance an individual's sense of agency and well-being. Another instrumental value, and all of this will become clear why I'm really listing these out, is that, he made these externally imposed constraints, in this case, physical impairment, which has typically been quite far from the central concerns of fine art, the subject of his later works of art. Psalm serves as this reminder of societal inequalities that exist between able and physically impaired bodies. And, the challenge that is presented to the latter by the former often failing to consider some of those challenges that might be presented by a world designed in a particular way. So through those kind of immersive and expressive formal and representational features of his works, he's offered audiences, both sensory and cognitive insights into what life with particular physical impairments is like. And in doing so has maybe conveyed the physical and mental effects of his condition more directly to an audience than, they might otherwise have been able to experience. And with something like Psalms, this is a helpful situation, I think. It's one that's at a useful remove from real world situations where, harm is actually done if we really do ignore or interrupt the path of an agent using a mobility aid. The art situation offers a safe environment for contemplation on the impact that the able-bodied can have on the physically impaired. So it should be noted, just before I carry on and go back to technology, that these are just among some of the values that these works have to offer. We shouldn't let an artist's disability colour historical readings to a degree that, as Gallant and Howie point out, may exclude other relevant readings. And likewise, you know, the foregoing is in no way intended to downplay the struggles of those who do face limitations and oppression due to circumstances that are beyond their control. But as Peg highlights, you know, often it might be the case that these achievements are undervalued. If we look to the struggles of, say, women artists to kind of really break through, Peg looks at someone like Judy Chicago to be actually recognised as they deserve to be. This can highlight a need to be more honest in how we judge the outputs of marginalised groups and aesthetic practices. Okay, right, so taking that forwards then, so externally imposed constraints can, I think, provide a creative catalyst, and by blocking certain paths and reliable methods can, despite their other negative impacts, stimulate the search for alternative paths with which to achieve artistic and aesthetic ends. So in cases where agents have had little room to structure their problem spaces due to externally imposed constraints, the paths that they choose to promote can, I think, be more important than those that they choose to preclude. So provided that this holds, I'm going to propose that while increased automation of the kind that we are finding in AI-driven image-making practice, while this may a priori appear to prohibit the opportunity for agents to exercise aesthetic choice that can lead to innovation and aesthetic diversity, this isn't necessarily the case. So, for instance, users of machine learning platforms and computational photographic processes, you know, do have, I think, certain paths and methods of expression blocked for them, thanks to those AI algorithms automatically generating and or adjusting the features of the images that the agents produce using these means. Now, while this might preclude agents from making some of the requisite choices involved in the image making process, it could still potentially stimulate the search for alternative paths with which to achieve aesthetic ends. So when we look at something like playform, for instance, you know, these can create more interesting feedback loops, not the ones that kind of reinforce and decrease diversity, but actually ones that might take agents' work in different paths. You know, by feeding in their work, this might provide a new perspective on the data that they train the model on. And again, this can in turn inform their choice, and so we can get this actually quite productive feedback loop. Yeah, so it's also worth noting, you know, users can exercise choice in the kind of data that they, well, not the kind actually, in the kind of images that they feed into the algorithm. In addition to altering parameters like the amount of time that you spend training the model on a particular data set. As I highlighted, you know, I didn't really spend very much time training the model that I showed earlier. If I'd have spent more time, the outcome would have been very much different. And if I'd have kind of honed in on certain kinds of outputs, again, that would have changed it. Now, it does still seem important, of course, for an agent to be able to recognize the nature of the problem space that they might be trying to navigate. There is still some need for that knowledge how, right? So here I'm going to appeal to working knowledge. Despite not being able to understand the underlying code, I don't think this needs to necessarily preclude an agent's ability to produce a range of aesthetic values using these AI-driven means, provided that they do, you know, after some experimentation, gain some knowledge of the effects of taking certain actions. Not to say they necessarily know the exact outcome, but, you know, as I say, they gain this kind of working knowledge of like, okay, well, if I train it for this long, maybe this kind of thing will happen. Or like, you know, if I put this kind of thing in, like, this might be an interesting way to see if I can get from here to here. So as Peg has discussed in relation to collaborations between artists and expert printmakers, between, say, like Chuck Close and Kathan Brown, those artists with the capital A, as she calls them, can push to defy the limits of a medium that's new to them, as they cross over into it, not yet knowing or having fully learned the skills needing to work in close collaboration with a trained professional technician or artist who does know and works within those limits. This might be an interesting place to draw some parallels, even where, you know, perhaps AI agents might play an important production role in the creation of the work. We might see them as important kind of co-producers, not necessarily kind of the creative driver behind an undertaking, but playing an important production role. With photo editing, we can also see some, opportunities there as well. I think there are plenty of users who have very playfully experimented with filters, again, based on a working knowledge. They might not know exactly how these filters, what the code behind them means, how they operate, but they do know the effects of certain actions. And it's also worth remembering, I think, that actually individuals can create preset modes for editing applications based on their preferences. You can actually also create and upload your own filters to social media platforms by using visual programming tools. Again, this isn't the same as actually going in and producing the code yourself, but it's still, a working knowledge of these tools and a way to choose what kind of paths to promote. So this is just one example, Spark AR Studio, where you can create these augmented reality filters. Again, you've clearly got some parameters here, but that doesn't mean that you can't still choose some really interesting paths to promote. Okay, so I'm trying to be optimistic. So I think that Brown and Stokes are definitely correct in a way. External constraints definitely make creative undertakings much more difficult. But harnessing the ability to promote different paths in these kinds of situations, I think frequently entails finding new ways to exercise agency, which can in turn, enhance and maybe reinforce one's sense of agency. Now, of course, this does put the onus on the individual to be, to be more active in trying to search for these new paths. But, with these particular kinds of externally imposed constraints in relation to the AI algorithms, these are, I think, less intractable than many of the other kinds of externally imposed constraints that I've mentioned. So in addition to kind of utilizing ways of forming a working knowledge of these technologies, there are other strategies, and I think that this is one of the real concerns that some of these theorists have expressed, to take to ensure a rich visual diet, so that you're not compromising your ability to formulate your own aesthetic plans or recognize when to capitalize on new opportunities when they present themselves. So it may be the case, and again, I do admit this really does put the onus on the individual. In theory, these technologies are there to make our lives easier, but it might just mean that we do work in different ways. It might be the case that users just have to regularly investigate what their smartphone cameras do and do not automatically do. Things often update. You might not be aware of them. You might just have to kind of keep a regular tab on it. In doing so, it might help you to form a knowledge of how to work with these more fruitfully. But also, there's a way to take some kind of control of algorithms by choosing what to engage with or actively searching for things that maybe don't appear on your feed. Again, the onus is very much then on the user to be like, okay, well, what am I not seeing? What's the opposite of what I'm seeing lots of? This could also be a good way to promote greater diversity on one's social media feeds if the concern is about AI algorithms compounding certain visual aesthetics. So finding ways to utilize and work around the structures that these technologies dictate, I think could contribute to an important boost, as I've mentioned, of one's agency, but also works as a way of appraising the workings of these technologies. T's written a fantastic paper about what he refers to as agential gullibility, where agents trust too readily or hold an unquestioning attitude towards, in this case, technological devices, and integrate their processes and structures into their agency without adequate reflection on how deep a change that they are making. So in addition to increasing awareness of how outsourcing to technologies might affect one's agency, it's also worth outlining, in the interest of optimism, as Manovich has done, that there do exist many different kinds of photo cultures on platforms like Instagram. And it might be that individuals actually are navigating very creatively within certain imaging conventions. I think he talks about, certain kind of sequencing techniques being very popular, but it might be that, there are actually very subtle innovations in these practices that just maybe aren't obvious to outsiders, but maybe very clear to those operating in these practices. They might even just reflect just the perspective of an outsider. Interestingly, he talks about this, the selfie kind of tilt that is very popular. And I think very optimistically says this similarity in face angles makes more clear the differences between faces. And yeah, the way that users have experimented with the selfie and at this angle. I'll leave that for you guys to judge. So, okay. It's also worth remembering that, users are still in control of what they input. It's up to them how to pose or compose or set up a scene to be photographed, for instance. Algorithms don't actually force users to pose a certain way. And this, I think, is a really important point to make. There's a big difference between there being pressure to produce something that looks a certain way and actually outsourcing those choices. I think a lot of the concerns pertain maybe to the former rather than the latter. In the case of AI enhanced photographic practices, it seems that it's actually certain social norms that might be a little bit more stifling of creativity due to social comparison and pressures to maintain a certain kind of social media presence. So, for instance, the place where I think it gets particularly tricky to start navigating these kinds of externally imposed constraints is where algorithms aren't trained well, or they're not kind of kept in check, and these can then compound pre-existing, I think, tendencies towards normative standards that have been and continue to be harmful. What this does is it just makes it much more visible through these very visual means. If we look at some of those beauty filters, for instance, not only can they be pretty harmful to one's self-esteem and self-image, but as some writers have noted, they can even perpetuate these racist ideas about beauty that might correspond to a white norm. As one user, the Snapchat beauty mode found when she and her sister, and this is her sister, took photos and found that it kind of lightened their skin and slimmed their noses. So that's not great. So I think that rather than a general concern about applications of AI algorithms leading to a lack of creativity and or aesthetic diversity, we really need to be focusing our concerns on the role that harmful social norms can play in contributing to the creation of certain kinds of algorithms that can reinforce and perpetuate harmful, and I think already existent homogenizations of value, which, if they're not subject to a kind of critical eye, can indeed reduce aesthetic diversity. Interestingly, I think some of the most creative work possibly is in response to the aesthetics of exclusionary or damaging norms. Another popular social media account recently is the Yassify trend, the Yassify bots. So these are heavily altered photographs of celebrities, I should say popular, and historical figures that have been made using, as you can see on the right-hand side there, an extreme amount of filters and edits that are available on things like Facetune. And these reproduce and really make a bit of a mockery of this very dominant selfie and now plastic surgery aesthetic, which is influenced by the likes of the Kardashians. I kind of wanted to include this one just because I like porridge and I thought this is a very funny use of this. So not only are these images amusing, but they can also be read as a critique of modern day beauty standards. As the creator of this bot, which isn't actually a bot, Denver Adams highlighted in this interview, he said there's something unhealthy about the culture of unrealistic beauty standards becoming seemingly normal. You can't tell what's real through an Instagram photo. So by promoting certain paths, I think that creators such as Adams, like others who have negotiated externally imposed constraints, have generated a number of values, including very clearly, I think in this case, these kind of artistic or aesthetic values. There's clearly a spontaneous dimension to this as well. Again, I think that being able to kind of take hold of these, in some cases, really extreme kind of beauty filters and really play around with those, and and kind of use them to a very different end to which they're intended can enhance a sense of agency and potentially well-being. And again, there's also another kind of instrumental value where, you know, of all the domains in which AI algorithms are being used, although I've pointed out some harms, you know, image making is still a relatively harmless one. These algorithms aren't deciding if certain people should be killed or not. So it's valuable to explore our relationship with AI, I think, through the relatively safe space of aesthetic means. Okay, so just another important point to mention here, this is one of my last and then I'll stop talking, is that I think we can also see an asymmetry here in how constraints impact on the acts of those agents that are involved in these image making practices when we consider that these involve, you know, Margaret Bowden uses the term AI agent, just in relation to the fact, you know, it makes choices. So that while, you know, these externally imposed constraints don't necessarily prohibit the opportunity for human agents to exercise aesthetic choices, the same, I think, isn't necessarily being, can't be said, sorry, with regard to the AI agents under discussion, in the sense that they lack the ability to exercise knowledge how and an evaluative ability that is independent of the goals of the human agency program. So while they kind of enact aesthetic choices, they're not kind of the source of creativity themselves. And yeah, I think for the foreseeable future, this is likely to remain the case. Okay, so to finally conclude, the account of the relationship between creativity and constraints that I've developed in this presentation, I think can be taken as a complement to Livingston's account. So this is to say, you know, agents are operating with these schematic notions about the kind of work they want to create and the role that such constraints can play in helping agents to perform the evaluative function that is crucial to creativity. Hopefully it can also be seen as a development on some of the quite brief comments that Livingston made pertaining to constraints not always being subject to deliberation or a matter of choice for the agents concerned. So despite first appearances, then creativity, as I've hopefully demonstrated here, I think can be enhanced by externally imposed constraints, even when they might otherwise negatively affect an individual's life. So in particular, I've suggested that values pertaining to the nature of the subject and the task can be generated by an agent having successfully negotiated externally imposed constraints, as well as value relating to the nature of that achievement more broadly. Hopefully, the foregoing also demonstrates that both self-imposed and externally imposed constraints can be used to generate novelty and value, whilst also acknowledging that it is still more difficult to do so in the latter case. So, in sum, I hope that the approach suggested here offers a way to account for the kinds of value generated by exercises of creative agency outlined in relation to aesthetic creation and AI, and hopefully additionally serves to bolster the case for the value of creativity as an exercise of agency more broadly. And this was what I ended up doing, by the way, with the things that I was training. I made a drawing. As I mentioned, I'm also a practicing artist. Anyway, thank you very much.